All right, hi everyone. Here we are in one of my sacred places. This is the Pnyx, the site of the ancient Athenian assembly. So 3 or 4 times a month, the Athenian citizens would have come here, and they would have made decisions on the important things facing their state. So whether to go to war, big things like that, major decisions facing the city-state. And here it is. I mean, it has a spectacular view of the Acropolis, as you can see. Other than that, it looks not particularly decorated or interesting, but as I say, this is in some ways a holy site if you're interested in democracy and ancient democracy, because it's where this very powerful organ of the Athenian people met. And actually, on the inscriptions where they recorded their decisions, the Athenians would often write "Edoxe teabule kai to demo," so it appeared right to the council and the people of Athens, or in other words, we decided. You know, the council and the people of Athens decided. And when they talk about the people in that context, they mean the assembly. And there are other references in ancient Athenian texts which make clear that this really was seen as one of the main, if not the, places where popular rule was manifested. You might think, for example, of Aristophanes' play The Knights, where he gives his personification of democracy the name Mr. Demos of Pnyx. So yeah, so if democracy was personified as a demos, Aristophanes seems to be telling us this is where Mr. Demos would be from. He would be from the Pnyx. So I'm just going to talk about the Pnyx today as a site, as a political site, as a political institution, or the site for a political institution. There are some other things around this site which are really interesting in their own right, some remainders of cult, so religious activity of various sorts, but I'm just going to focus on the classical Pnyx. The Pnyx is the site of an assembly. And in this sense, the Pnyx actually has 3 phases. So there's the 5th century Pnyx, the 4th century Pnyx, and the final phase of the Pnyx, which, as we'll see, is kind of in the final decades of the 4th century BC. So yeah, if you don't know anything about Athenian democracy at all, basically the classical period is the 5th century and the 4th century BC, and a lot of people think that the democracy kind of changes between the 5th and the 4th centuries BC, so they're kind of different phases. And as we'll see, the Pnyx is a site that actually plays right into that division between the 5th and the 4th century. There's a big change that happens between what we'll call Pnyx I and Pnyx II around the turn of the century. But let's start off with the 5th century Pnyx. So it dates to sometime after the reforms of Cleisthenes. The reforms of Cleisthenes around 508/7, which really established the democracy. So that's what John Camp, the very famous American archaeologist who was head of the American excavations in the Agora for a long time. John Camp thinks, yeah, the Pnyx is set up, Pnyx I is set up soon after Cleisthenes founds the democracy. Or the alternative theory, by a sort of equally famous Danish historian, Mogens Hansen, the alternative theory is that Pnyx I really starts later on. So in the period of the reforms of Ephialtes, probably, so around 462 to 1, so after the reforms of Ephialtes, which made Athens even more democratic in various ways. So the Areopagus, which had formerly been seen as a more aristocratic body, is weakened, and the magistracies, the city offices, are slightly more open to more people further down the economic pecking order. So it's an important series of changes, and Mogens Hansen thinks, yeah, that's when you really have the Pnyx I. And in this period, people would have sat in a semicircle directly on the rocky surface. And to the north of them, there was probably a low wall with a speaker's platform or bema on it. So to the north, I mean down that way. So the sea is kind of in that direction. There's the Acropolis. That's the west end of the Parthenon up there. And so here's the north. So you imagine looking down this way, maybe through that tree or just down there to the left of it. Just imagine a speaker speaking there. And so someone addressing the assembly here would have faced uphill, right? So the natural slope of the hill. And they would have faced southward. So you're speaking in the Pnyx, and you're speaking towards this direction, towards the south. So yeah, the people would have been looking northward at, the people seated in this area would have been looking northward at the speaker, and they could probably see you know, the Acropolis, maybe not directly behind him, but over his shoulder. They could definitely see it. We can see it now, right? You can definitely see the Acropolis. So the area where the people sat was bounded only by the fact that the artificial smoothing of the rock stops at a certain point. But actually nothing would have stopped people sitting behind this roughly semicircular smoothed area. And this area is about 2,400 square meters. So Hansen estimates, based on modern mass meetings, that a person needs about 0.4 meters to sit in or on. So Hansen's way of proceeding here is just to say, well, how much space does a bum take up? You know, someone's sitting down, how much space does that take up? And he thinks, okay, 0.4 meters. And if we go with that assumption, then the smoothed off area is around 2,400 square meters. And so the conclusion you get is that this area of the Pnyx in phase 1 would have had room for about 6,000 citizens. And this does seem to square with Thucydides' assertion in the time of the Peloponnesian War. 432 to 404 BC. Thucydides says that there were rarely more than 5,000 people present at an assembly meeting. And this is kind of a known thing in the 5th century, that they seem to have trouble getting that many people to the assembly. We later know that there's a quorum of 6,000 for some really important decisions. So they want more people at the assembly. They have trouble doing this in the 5th century. All right, so John Camp says that in this period, the Pnyx accommodates between 8,000 and 13,000 people. So he doesn't actually say how he arrives at this figure, but it may be that he's looking at the flat top of the Pnyx hill as a whole, right? The whole area, not just the smoothed off area. Or maybe he's rejecting Hansen's assumption that an ancient Athenian would have taken up about as much space as a modern person. And actually, you know, in fact, we know that ancient Athenians were somewhat smaller. You know, from skeletal evidence, we know the ancient Greeks were actually smaller than us. So Pnyx 1 may well have had space for more people than Hansen thinks. All right, so this is the Pnyx of the radical democracy of the 5th century BC. Here the people, Pericles, Cleon, people that we know and maybe not love, but we read about in the sources would have spoken. And the Athenians made these decisions, like the launching of the disastrous Sicilian expedition that we read about in the sources, in Thucydides in that case. Unfortunately, it's the least visible phase, right? You can't actually, archaeologically, you can't really see much. It only really has left the slightest traces in a boundary stone, as John Camp says. Only the slightest traces in a boundary stone survive from this period. All right, so let's move on then to the 4th century Pnyx. So Camp dates this to the time of the 30 tyrants, right? The 30 tyrants are these extreme oligarchs who take over the city in 403 after the end of the Peloponnesian War. By take over, I mean they're basically handed the city by the Spartans, and they're not very pleasant. They end up prescribing and killing a lot of political enemies. But anyway, so they're around in 403, and the discussion of what happens at this point, at the beginning of Pnyx 2, is really, a lot of it's based around this passage in Plutarch's Life of Themistocles. Plutarch's Life of Themistocles is obviously written much later, 2nd century AD, and I'll quote that. So it says, Plutarch says, "Therefore it was that the bema, the speaker's platform in the Pnyx, which had stood so as to look off to sea, was afterwards turned by the 30 tyrants so as to look inland, because they thought that rule of the sea fostered democracy, whereas farmers were less likely to be bothered by oligarchy." Okay, so therefore it was that the speaker's platform in the Pnyx, which had stood so as to look off the sea, was afterwards turned by the 30 tyrants so as to look inland, because they thought the rule of the sea fostered democracy, whereas farmers were less likely to be bothered by oligarchy. All right, so that's why John Camp thinks that this change to the Pnyx 2 happened in 403, because it's basically saying that what happens now is, in 403 is that the orientation of the Pnyx completely flipped. The speaker starts to look in a different direction. And of course, by extension, the audience also starts to look in a different direction. So Hansen, though, and the Greek Archaeological Service picture book, they date this change to around 400 BC. Since it kind of doesn't make much sense for the 30 tyrants to be the ones to refurbish the site of the People's Assembly, right? So if there was a switch, it probably wasn't the 30 tyrants who made the switch. Whereas if you think about it, after the 30 tyrants get expelled in the same year, then it actually would make sense for the restored democracy a couple years later to remodel the space, right? Because, you know, they're like, we're a democracy again, we're restoring this democracy, and so that would be really convenient. It would be a really, you know, understandable thing for them to want to do, is to kind of refurbish the site of the most important, arguably the most important democratic institution. All right, so whenever precisely this was, so it was around 403 or 400 anyway, sometime around then. This was a major reshaping of the space, and a lot of work would have gone into bringing thousands of tons of earth up the hillside to sort of, it says, I say in my notes, eliminate the natural slope of the hill. It doesn't quite eliminate the slope of the hill, but to kind of level it off. And in order to help keep this new artificial level in place, the Athenians also built a semicircular retaining wall to the north, which we'll actually go and look at the end. And here's the most dramatic and important change that's made at this point. So the Pnyx, as we've mentioned, it flips. And the bema, the speaker's platform, is moved to the south, so that the speaker now faces the Acropolis and the countryside behind it. And he has his back to the sea. So the sea's over there, right? The speaker's now speaking from up there where that chap is, a bit further along in that area. So all of which brings us back to the Plutarch passage where he says that the 30 tyrants did this deliberately to make the people more oligarchic. So he says if they stood on the speaker's platform, they'd see the countryside. And that would remind them of their farms, you know, and how nice oligarchy was. This ties into this cliche in a lot of classical texts that links oligarchy and farming, or moderate oligarchy and farming, the kind of hoplite franchise idea in some sense, and also links radical democracy in the navy, right? That you might have heard of the naval mob that various oligarchic authors in Athens talk about. All right, so I think we need to be a little bit careful with Plutarch, right, as a source for the classical period. He's writing in the 2nd century AD. I mean, obviously he has access to texts that we've since lost, so, you know, we can learn a lot from it. It's always wise, I think, to be a little bit skeptical with an author so late. So for me, the main problem with this passage is that even though, if you think about it, even though the speaker is going to be facing the countryside, so the speakers are looking out there, where are all the people listening to the speakers going to be? Or where are they going to be looking? So they're going to be here and they're going to be looking that way. So they'll be facing the sea. And they're actually the ones who are voting. So you could equally say, well, if you put the speaker over there and have the people looking at the sea, then that'll make them more democratic, right? Because they'll be looking at the sea. So would the 30 tyrants have done that? So I just think there's a number of reasons why we shouldn't take that Plutarch passage too seriously. Anyway, we do know there's been a change. And we could probably move away now from literary texts back to the world of archaeology. And we can see that when they made the level section of the hill, this left a big gap between the edge of the new level section and the natural slope of the hill to the north, so down there. And that's where they built this huge retaining wall. And because they had this big retaining wall, they had to build these 2 stairways leading up to the assembly space. And they did this to enable people to get in easily, but also to have a more impressive entrance to the assembly. But note also that they're now, these are now the only 2 ways in and out of the assembly space. So it's not like in the 5th century where you can just wander up here from any direction. They've actually sort of formally remodeled the space. You have to come in through these 2 entrances. And we'll come back to that in a second. But first, so how big is this new space? Well, it's actually slightly larger. It's about 2,600 square meters. So it's slightly larger, meaning about 200 square meters larger than Pnyx 1. But in this period, citizens actually sit on wooden benches, and as a result, they probably each need slightly more room. And Henson suggests that the total number that could fit into the new space was probably a bit bigger than in the 5th century, but not massively bigger, so about 6,000. And we know that you need a quorum of 6,000 people, as I mentioned, for certain measures to pass. And we also know that state pay for attending the assembly is introduced in the 390s, and that's shortly after this new space has been created. And that after this point, there's no longer any problem in getting people to the assembly, right? So you say, we'll pay you for the trouble of going to the assembly. And now the problem starts to be that too many people are turning up. And this is where the entrances come in. So Henson suggests that people would have filed into the assembly until it was full. At that point, it would have been clear that the quorum of 6,000 had been reached. So it's kind of like, we know that once this space is filled up, there's around 6,000 men in the assembly. And that would have also made clear who had actually attended the assembly. And so people could have collected their payment as they filed back out of the 2 exits from the space of the Pnyx. Right, so this is the Pnyx that Demosthenes spoke at. Unfortunately, today only part of the retaining wall and the road that led to one of the staircases are still visible. So finally we get to phase 3 of the Pnyx, Pnyx 3, and I'm calling this the final phase because we're not quite sure when this phase dates to, although at this point there's a pretty strong consensus that it's from the late 4th century. So Hansen for a long time defended an alternative dating, that it was actually in the time of Hadrian, so much, much later, right? But a series of studies by the likes of John Camp and others, they eventually sort of won the argument effectively, and I think now there's a consensus that that this is actually from the 330s or the 320s, phase 3 of the Pnyx, or at least it was begun in the 330s or 320s. And actually, if you read Hansen's great book, or textbook, I suppose, great summary of the evidence for Athenian democracy, book is called The Athenian Democracy in the Age of Demosthenes. Hansen actually has an appendix where he basically says it's a fair cop, and yeah, he revises his earlier support for the Hadrianic date, so it kind of shows the other side has won that particular argument. And so 330s or 320s, we're in the phase of Athenian history which is, I wouldn't say dominated because it's still a democracy, but certainly Lycurgus, this figure called Lycurgus, a financial expert, is a big deal, and he is one of the things he's doing is a building program. So it may have been part of that. So part of his building program was the new theater of Dionysus with stone seats. Actually, the theater of Dionysus doesn't have stone seats in the 5th century, but it does from the time of Lycurgus. So maybe he also remodeled the Pnyx. So I say that this phase begun in the 330s and 20s because this phase is actually amazingly, and some would say insanely ambitious, which maybe explains why it seems not to have been completed. So in particular, there are 2 stoas that were begun just behind the bema here, the speaker's platform. They were abandoned at an early stage. And basically this phase just redoes phase 2, but much, much bigger and better. So the bema stays in the south, speaker is facing north, but it's raised and it's moved back to make room for a much bigger auditorium here, which is basically built over the top of Pnyx 2 by moving even more earth. Of course, all this needs an even bigger retaining wall, and it's down there. And there's one further change. The 2 earlier staircases are replaced by a single central entrance. All right, and this new space may have been as big as 5,500 square meters. And if that's right, it would have held as many as 13,500 people. And that's actually the figure that the Greek Archaeological Service is backing in their picture book, but also on the picture board on the site here. And if that's right, that would actually be very interesting. So interesting because in the 330s and the 320s, the Athenians are losing. They're losing to an autocratic threat, Philip of Macedon. They lose the Battle of Chaeronea in 338. Of course, then you have Alexander the Great, who basically conquers, well, the known world, or to the east, or Persia, and dies in 323. And the Athenians join an uprising in the Lamian or the Hellenic War, but it then gets crushed. So it's not a great time for democracy, but it may be that in this period of decline they have some of their biggest ever meetings. And it's kind of a romantic thought to think that maybe in some of these years you still have figures like Demosthenes, or maybe the very beginning of this period, figures like Demosthenes, and actually Demosthenes defending himself in the speech on the crown, actually defending his whole career. You have that in this period, and maybe speakers like that are addressing this huge assembly with 13,000 citizens in it. Anyway, so this is the phase that kind of survives. So this is the retaining wall down here and this huge bema up there. So this is the Pnyx 3. This is the Pnyx of Lycurgus, and it's actually the last Pnyx that's used as the site of the assembly, because we know that the assembly moves to the theater of Dionysus in around 300 BC. So yeah, just pick up my phone case. And we'll just walk around a little bit. So yeah, huge bema, huge speakers platform. There you go. Vima ritoros in modern Greek, bema in ancient Greek. I think you can still imagine people seated in this area, and yeah, so this is the speakers are facing people here. I'm sort of walking through from the speaker's point of view, as it were, and then you get down here, and it's this area where we think that Pnyx 1 in the 5th century would have had a bema, probably quite a modest bema, and then in the 5th century, that's where you have the speaker facing, ready for it, okay, facing this way, speaker facing uphill, without that, I think without that big bema, yeah, definitely without that Pnyx 3 bema there. All right, and then so down here, I think this is probably later, but this is about where the central entrance would have been, and I'm not sure quite how much of this retaining wall, or quite the date of this retaining wall, but you can see the effect if we go down here. You get the general idea if we just try not to fall off the retaining wall. Don't want to illustrate my point that much, but yeah, there's a little path. All the way around, and then I'm going to go back towards the entrance and exit to this wonderful archaeological site, which actually I don't think it gets quite as much credit, doesn't get quite as much attention as the Acropolis. Okay, so maybe there aren't all these amazing temples on top, but as I say, I think it's actually, in some ways, it's arguably more important for history, definitely in terms of institutional history, the history of democracy, which obviously all good people are interested in, or should be. So yeah, so there you go. This is this bit massive retaining wall. And so you have to imagine, I'm pretty sure this must be Pnyx 3. And you have to imagine that in the period of Pnyx 2, so in the 4th century, where they have this system where you fill out the Pnyx and then people file back through these two entrances, you have to imagine that there are these two entrances and exits that sort of go through this area. Yeah, so that's the Pnyx. Let me know if you have any questions or if I made any mistakes. I'd love more feedback because I'm not an expert archaeologist. So yeah, cheers.